Hello and a warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining this Hardman Co Investor Forum. My name is Keith Hiscock and I'm the Chief Executive of Hardman Co. These forums give investors the chance to hear a company's investment case and then question the management. And today we've got 4 presentations. Our first presentation comes from Dr. Martin Hall, who is our head of our life sciences team here at Hardman Co. Martin holds a B.Pharm in pharmacy from the School of Pharmacy at the University of Liverpool, has a PhD in neuropharmacology from the University of London, and then after 2 years of a postdoctoral Royal Society Fellowship at the Collège de France in Paris, he became leader in biochemical pharmacology at the Park Davis Research Centre in Cambridge. Martin's career started in the city as a healthcare analyst back in 1987, so he's got plenty of experience. And Martin's going to make a short presentation on rare diseases and specialist products. Martin, over to you.
Welcome everybody, and hope you enjoy mine and the company presentations. We've got 3 very interesting companies presenting today. Right, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of the pharmaceutical industry. It is very brief because, as Keith said, I've been following this sector for a long time, and I could actually talk about it for the whole session, but we've got more important companies to listen to. I do find the whole industry very inspirational. What I've learned over many years is that there are a number, or there have been, and there are always a number of world-beating technologies that come out of the UK, whether they're in the industry itself, universities, or small companies. And I think that over the last 18 months, this has been exemplified and really noticeable through COVID-19. The challenges brought about by that pandemic really saw a number of companies in the sector and technologies step up to the mark to try and address those issues. And those are the types of reasons why what gets me excited, learning about the new technologies. Throughout my time as an analyst, I'm sure you can imagine I've met many interesting people, and they too get very excited about the technologies that they're developing. At Hardman, we've got a fantastic database on pharmaceuticals, and we're building on that every day because every day provides new information, and that goes into that database. And we try to portray segments of that in our publications and add value in a slightly different way. What gets me out of bed? Well, ultimately, I don't think there's a day that passes without me learning something new. And that is both inspirational and exciting. And then being able to collate all of this information together to try and add value in the research that we produce. But the one thing that has never changed over all the time I've followed the industry is that it's continuously evolving. So just a very quick look from an investment standpoint. What are the opportunities? What are the risks? I think this is fairly obvious and straightforward. There's clearly clinical need. We're very aware that antibiotics are becoming less effective. I think I could easily have put anti-infectives there because of COVID-19, which is, of course, an antiviral. COVID-19 has highlighted the mental health of the nation, and that's not just the UK, that's globally, and the dearth of drugs that are really effective in CNS, central nervous system disorders. And of course, everybody talks about oncology. There's clearly a global need for new medicines, and this is also the case not only in developed countries, but in the less developed countries as well. We're all conscious of the aging population, but what I've seen over the years is whereas big industry used to focus on a number of major causes of death some years ago. So, for example, cardiovascular problems. As we've got medicines and technologies to solve those problems, then, of course, the problems move into other disease states. And I think we probably put oncology into that category. Lifestyle plays an incredibly important part of the opportunity. And personal lifestyle is going to be increasingly important. And there was a survey out from the NHS just last year that said that basically 50% of the population in the UK, including children, is overweight, has a BMI that is too large. And therefore, this is inevitably going to lead to more diabetes in the future. On the risk side, nothing much has changed. It still takes a long time to develop a new drug. The probability of success, despite all of the efforts of a number of people, but the probabilities haven't really changed in the time that I've been following it. There have been some very interesting improvements in regulation, but it still is a major hurdle and does add 1 year to the development of a new drug. We're all very conscious of the fact that it's a very expensive process. Clearly, some people can do it for less money than others, but I'm just looking at averages. And the expensive process I'll show you in the next couple of slides. And the economics are increasingly important, whereas before, say 20 years ago, whilst economics were important, it's now an important consideration for all new drugs to know the ability of payers to pay and to actually provide health economics of the benefits of using your product. But the thing that has never changed is the increasing demand for new technologies. This next slide just shows the number of FDA approvals over the last 20 years. If we went back even further, of course, it would only be small molecule new drug applications or new chemical entities. Biopharmaceuticals actually kicked in for the first time in the year 2000. And you can see that in the last few years, there has been an improvement in the number of approvals made by the FDA. But at the end of the day, this is still not enough. I follow approximately 40 drug companies, 40 major companies throughout the industry on a global basis. And these numbers equate to only one new drug per major company per annum. And of course, if you're selling billions of dollars of sales, that's not enough to replace an old drug that's losing patent protection. So just to show you a little bit on the drug development costs, you can see that back in 1990, $14.8 billion was spent on developing drugs. And that equated to 15.3% of the pharmaceutical sales of those companies. And you can see how much that has risen, and such that last year, according to my numbers, and they might be out by about a billion, but of the 40 companies that I'm monitoring, they between them spent 138.7 billion. And that now represents 20.2% of sales being reinvested back into R&D. I think there's a perception that there's thousands and thousands of drugs approved and available for consumers. The reality is that since 1990, in the 40 years, there have only been 980 new chemical entities approved by the FDA. And the average, and the total amount of money spent, as you can see, is this staggering nearly 2 trillion, phenomenal sums. The average cost per drug last year the average cost of doing all of those drugs on a 10-year cycle was 2 billion, just under 2 billion per annum. which of course is a large number that is an average for the big industry. But interestingly, when I rolled around the data for the last 2 years, that average has actually just eased off a little bit, which reflects the increased number of approvals being made by the FDA. But my conclusion from all of this is the big companies can't develop all the drugs themselves, so they need the biotech and the specialist pharma companies, and vice versa, because the small companies often struggle to fully commercialize their products. And we're going to hear about some very interesting approaches in the companies today. So I just wanted to focus a little bit on an area of the industry that I see changing, and it is relevant to the talks that are going to follow. Again, I think there's a perception that the pharmaceutical industry has really strong growth. But the reality is that whilst there are new drugs hitting the market, and they do tend to be quite expensive compared to previous drugs, the reality is, of course, that there are always patents expiring and the introduction of generics. And over the last few years, even those early biopharmaceuticals are now being replaced by biosimilars, as they're called. So overall, the growth in the industry looks to be about 4.5%, 4.4% over the next 5 years. And that's not materially different from the figure that we've had for the last 5 years. But when you cut it in a slightly different way and actually look at, I've put it in as rare diseases, but I think I'm trying to include specialty products, products really targeting patients with unmet medical need, and rare diseases. These were areas that big pharma had no interest in 20, 30 years ago. They just wanted to focus on the very large opportunities. But you can see that this is a major growth area and does represent quite a significant proportion of the industry today. And you can see that we're expecting a growth rate of a low double digits, 12% over the next 5 years. And so it is an area that is increasingly interesting to the investment community. So just to summarize, hopefully I've whetted your appetite. It's an absolutely fantastic industry to follow. Of course, I've got a personal interest. It's been my life for my whole academic and working life. But from an investment standpoint, hopefully I've alerted people to just to be aware of the chances of success and what the risk-reward analysis is. It's fantastic if you happen to pick the right companies, and the right companies really commercialize their products well. Management is key, in my opinion, to success, and having people that really know and understand where their products fit in the industry. Of course, from an investment standpoint and share price movements, it is always important to know the timing of potential capital increases. Fortunately, certainly 2 of the 3 companies today have good balance sheets, and I'm sure you'll hear more from their CEOs. And finally, just a word of warning, all CEOs think their shares are cheap. But having said that, I do think that all 3 opportunities that are presented tonight, that really is the case from a Hardman perspective as well. So if you are an investor, good luck, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Martin, I've got a couple of questions, if I may. So the first one is going back to your point about how long it takes to get approval for a new drug. I guess the general perception is that it's one of astonishment as how fast the vaccines got approval for COVID. Was that something unusual? Are there any lessons to be learnt from that? Might we be able to shorten the process of getting approval in the future for other drugs, for other treatments?
I think it's going to be very difficult. Certainly, it's opened up the eyes of what can be achieved when the right technologies are put in front of the regulators. Clearly, with COVID, there was an element of government pressure to approve the products. And I think that this was particularly the case at the FDA. I think they would have preferred to have gone somewhat slower. But that wasn't a choice for them. They had to work quickly. And it just shows how the regulators can really work quickly. Of course, the biggest concern of the regulators is safety. And I think that maybe there might be some improvements from the overall process if you can show really good safety data from a very early stage. But the reality is, Keith, that all drugs have to go through a specific process, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then go through the regulatory process. And even in the best will in the world, you might be able to shave with certain drugs a little bit off that, but the reality is not much.
And my second question, the final question is, if you had the choice between a company with a good balance sheet and a company with a good drug, which would you go for?
I would always go with the good drug, because I think if you've got a good drug and it's put across to the investment community in the right way, it will always get funded.
Okay.
Famous last words.
Thank you very much for that, Martin, and we'll see you back on the Q&A, hosting the Q&A sessions later on. Okay, so let's move on to our first company, which is Incanthera. So Incanthera is committed to the development of novel treatments for solid tumours and licensing these to large pharmaceutical companies. It grew out of the University of Bradford Institute of Cancer Therapeutics. It operates from Manchester with research facilities in Bradford and Salford, and it's listed on the Aqueous growth market with a market cap of 9 million. Pleased to be joined today by both the chairman, Tim McCarthy, and the CEO, Dr. Simon Ward. Gentlemen, over to you.
Keith, thank you for the introduction. Just to differentiate between the two of us, I'm Tim McCarthy, the chairman of the company, and I'm joined by Simon, our CEO. Well, it's a pleasure to come to the conference, the seminar this afternoon, evening, and to get started the evening. So we're going to introduce to you Incanthera, which, as Keith said, is listed on the Aqueous growth market here in London. And we're going to take you through the genesis of the company, the portfolio, and then what our commercial plans are going forward. So the company is concentrated in the area of oncology or novel cancer medicines, and there's a general theme running through all of our development programs, which is what we call targeted technology. So in short, what we're aiming to do is to develop novel oncology medicines, which are very effective, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't be developing them, but to direct them into the body in such a way that we minimize or eliminate all of the usual side effects that one usually experiences or patients experience when they're going through therapy for oncology. Keith very kindly gave us a little bit of an introduction here in terms of where we came from, but the company heritage is from the University of Bradford. And on the campus at Bradford, there is a specific unit called the Institute of Cancer Therapeutics. Now, this is not a particularly well-known facility, but it's a building which is a 4-story building, housing about 50 researchers and support staff, professors, PhDs, postgraduates, all concentrating in the area of oncology research. We've got some very clever people there. And the way the company developed was just over 10 years ago, the university approached Simon to ask his assistants in advising them how they could start to commercialize the early stage research which they were developing. And cut a long story short, the solution for that was a typical spin out company, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with in this area, in this industry. And so Simon formed the company, and the first product was brought in, and we purchased or licensed that technology, but in a way that we acquired it 100%. So we're not reliant on licenses which would run out. And the commercial terms of that were that we did an equity swap in order to acquire the rights to that first drug. And then the clever bit, which Simon did at the time, was to say to the university dons, look, guys, I can start this company, bring the new product in, but I can't develop a company without a pipeline. Because we're in the risk business here and not all these drugs are going to work. So we entered into, as a company, what we call the pipeline agreement, which we've actually just recently renewed. So we've got about 8 years left on that, and it will renew again. And we get first look at everything that comes out of the institute in our area of oncology. So very important for a company like ours to have that continuing pipeline. And to date, we've taken 3 products in total under that deal, as well as acquiring assets from other sources as well. So when we come later on to the slide deck to the portfolio, you see that we've got a number of products under development in the pipeline. And that very first deal, very first piece of technology, which was the establishment of the company, we have already licensed that out. So our first commercial deal. And that actually, if you look at the strap line at the bottom of the page, acquire, prepare, commercialize, is a very good demonstration of what our business model is. And that is we acquire in one way or the other, either through the university connection or through our other connections in the industry. We acquire good technology, which we believe we can develop. So use the word prepare, but we only develop it as far as we need to, such that we can get it out to a licensee and start generating revenue for the company. So that's the basic business model of the company. We're not in a situation where we want to be raising tens of millions of pounds in investors' money to put into programs which are going to keep as long as we can, because there's always a trade-off between investment risk and how much value you add before you pass it on to typically larger pharmaceutical players. And just before we go to the next slide, you may be wondering where the name came from. And if you're ahead of me, if you look at Shield Therapeutics and you squash it up, then that's where the name Incanthera came from. This next slide, it's just a little bit more detail of what I just described about the business model in terms of firstly identifying those technologies to bring them in. And I emphasize again that our business model is to own all those intellectual property rights. We don't want to be hanging out on a license deal where we've acquired technology. And then we do the absolute minimum we need to in terms of development and investment in that development before we look for commercial partners. So we're very much looking in the very near future, in the next 2 or 3 years, to build a model whereby the revenues are self-generating cash, that we are in a position where we don't need to come back to the capital market for monies. And so it's self-perpetuating. So as new opportunities come through, we have enough cash through the revenues to develop those and get them out to commercial partners. And we're looking to build at quite an early stage, a revenue generating model, which is producing profits and cash generation. And that, I think, is really important when investors are looking at the opportunity of Incanthera. This is the team. It won't surprise you that we are operating in the virtual model or the outsourcing business model, which is very common now for small companies in our industry. So what that means is that we have the core team, and the people and bios you see on this slide is everybody in the company. That's the lot of us. So myself and Simon, who've got slightly different backgrounds. Mine is very much a financial corporate background. Simon's is very much a scientific. So we complement each other very well. Alan is our independent non-exec, industry background with pharma. Then Pavel, who looks after the intellectual property, Laura, who's a part-time CFO, and Suzanne, who looks after all of our investor relations and is also the company secretary. So a really, really tight team. We work very well together. There's a lot of complementarity. And then whenever we do development, we put that out to specialist companies that will do manufacturing or development of one sort or testing. And we just pay for that as we go. So again, we're keeping the overheads extremely low, which again, I think is important from the investment perspective. And we're putting investors' money where it really counts, and that is to add value to the product development programs. So this is a snapshot of what we've done in the last 18 months or so. So I think when Keith introduced us and I started the slide presentation, I mentioned that we're now on the Aqueous growth market in London. So that happened in February 20. And that was an interesting time for us, because I think, if I remember right, it was the 28th, 27th, the 28th of February, right at the end of the month, literally days before the whole country went into lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
So we got in by the skin of our teeth. We've had actually a very good experience on Aqueous. And if any of you aren't familiar with that particular market, I would encourage you to look at companies on it, because I think the guys there are doing a fantastic job. And since we listed, we're up about 20% share price. You can see from the graph on the right, we had quite a good increase as we were putting regular news flow out, which is, I'll come back to detailed on the left. And then it's come up a little bit in the past 6 months or so. But as we look forward, and we'll come back to that later in the slideshow, we are looking forward to quite a lot of news flow coming up for the next 6 months or so, which I'm sure will drive that share price and value forward. But a quick snapshot on the left, and I know Simon's going to go a little bit more into this in terms of the technology, especially for our leading drug development, which is a product called SOL. You'll see there's a number of references to SOL on there. Permeation study, sensitization study, new patent filings, etc. And this is a really, really exciting, quite very, very novel approach to the problem of melanoma, as most of you will know, or skin cancer, which Simon will explain in a lot more detail. And then we actually have raised more money since we've come to Aqueous. So in March this year, early this year, we did a placing raise just over £1 million, which gave us another extension to our cash runway. We're actually very parsimonious. We don't spend a lot of money. If you go back to the business model, which I described to you earlier on, so that augurs very well for the future, I think. So at this point, as a really quick canter through the introduction of the company, and I'm going to hand over to Simon to take you through some of the technical side.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks, and thanks everybody for listening. I won't labour our pipeline, although I would love to spend hours talking my way through it. But I'll try and highlight the sort of key points and focus possibly much more on SOL, which is our lead program at the moment. As Tim mentioned, we're in oncology, clearly, and our take on oncology is to try and look for drugs that have some kind of targeting moiety. And the majority of the drugs in our portfolio are what we call prodrugs, or targeting prodrugs. Prodrugs is a bit of an old word in the industry and generally used to define a piece of chemistry that try to overcome such barriers as its inability to be soluble and all these sort of physicochemical characteristics. But you can also configure chemistry to act as a prodrug such that its activity, its inherent biological activity, is switched on in certain situations, but otherwise kept neutered. And for oncology, obviously that opens up a whole new avenue of taking a very dangerous, if you like, drug that will clearly kill a cancer, but will also possibly have lots of iatrogenic effects in killing all of the other good cells. But keep it neutered, keep the safety catch on that gun until it actually sees the cancer, and then lift that safety catch. And that was the approach we took. And so the programs here that are on the slide, EP0015, Equin, and GOC, all take that approach, but they use different signals to actually switch on the chemistry. And obviously they use different chemistry to effect the treatment of the cancer. And as Tim said, EP0015 is already out licensed to a third party. So we were very happy about that. But recently, we've become very interested in skin cancer, and SOL is our lead program in skin cancer. And it's a huge opportunity for us because the challenge of skin cancer is huge. We all know this. You know, we live in a world where we are almost bombarded every day by everything about the sun and what UV irradiation can do to our skin, from just drying it up, from actually helping sometimes in cases such as eczema and psoriasis. But clearly the whole skin cancer thing coming from UV irradiation as an exposure is very high on the list. And actually very recently, I don't know if anyone of you read some of the tabloids, there was an article that came out that said 75% of all Australians will be diagnosed with some form of skin cancer in their lifetime. Whether that holds up true, I think it just epitomizes the type of thinking that we have nowadays. And you walk into your local pharmacist or WH Smith or whatever it is, or you're in the airport and you're absolutely bombarded by a million different creams for sun care, be it sun tanning or for big SPF factor bottles and all these things. It's very much in your face, and there is a reason for that. This graph on the right here really sort of shows you this, that the skin cancer rates are just going up and up and up, and quite scarily so. It's gone up 45% in the last 10 years, fifth most common cancer in young adults. And that's important. It's young adults we're talking about here. In the dermatology world, we used to think about skin cancers as being really a problem of old age, because it's a dosage thing. You expose your skin to the sun, and the more you expose it, the more likely you are to have a skin cancer. So the older you get, the more exposure you've had, and bingo, your chances go up. But actually, when you look at the demography at the moment, it's shifting backwards. It's coming more into that 25 to 50 sort of year-old bracket. In the UK, it's increased 70% in that bracket. It's really scary. So it kind of comes back to that young affluent person who can then travel, who can strip off and run around in lovely hot sun and enjoy his holiday, but also expose himself to UV irradiation that otherwise he would never have seen. And it is dangerous. And clearly we're seeing the effects of that in the statistics. For a small company like us, though, working in this particular field, sun care, let's move away from the oncology side, think about sun care. It's a massive industry. We're talking about a 13, 14 billion pound industry by 2024, where the numbers are silly, they're huge numbers for smaller companies. And so it's quite exciting for a small company to have a look at this particular area. What we know about our skin, of course, is quite a lot. And in terms of the sun and the UV irradiation, it boils down to two things. Obviously, cancers start and end with DNA damage and things that go wrong at the sort of the genetic level. And we have all sorts of mechanisms to try and prevent that happening in our skin. And we have an innate immunity to these things, innate immunity to mutations that will go on and cause cancer. And it's these two sort of elements that we really need to concentrate on to provide some kind of preventative, if not cure, but at least preventative towards the UV irradiation that we're under attack from all the time. Now, actually, as it happens, we do know one particular molecule, and forgive me for not actually mentioning it outright. We have a patent that will be coming public towards the end of the year, so then I can take all of the gloves off and talk openly about it. But there is a molecule out there that we know will help both of these particular biological functions and actually fortify the skin against these problems, and actually start to treat the first insult that we see when we get UV irradiation, which is a change in the skin that we label actinic or solar keratosis. You'll hear it by both words. But for those of you who had it, you know the problems with these things. It's a nasty change in the skin. It's a reddened skin. It sort of blisters. It's obviously very painful. Treatment's not nice, and further exposure to UV irradiation is painful, but also leads to a change in those cells that can turn into a cancer itself. So these are things that we have to be aware of, and things that we really want to try and stop. And going back to what I started the sentence with, we have a molecule here that we know and has been proven actually in phase 3 trials can cause a reversion of the changes brought about by UV irradiation, particularly for actinic keratosis, and also acts as a suppressant, or if you like, a preventative towards the onset of skin cancers. So I guess the big question is, well, why the heck aren't we using it all the time? And it would be lovely if we could, but the problem with it is that the proof of the pudding has always been in oral administration of this particular compound. And to get enough levels into the body to make this effect and to have this preventative function, you actually have to eat barrel loads of the stuff. And in fact, those clinical trials lasted over a year, and you were taking quite a lot of it. So it's just not something that we can just factor into our daily lives and make that change. However, when we start thinking about that in terms of dermatology is not really about taking pills and parenteral sort of administration of drugs, although those do exist for some diseases, of course. It really likes to have creams and ointments and unctions that you actually wipe on your skin. Your skin is accessible, it's there. So let's put something directly on the insult in the first place. So the challenge has always been here, well, can we take this particular molecule that has all of these great potentials and turning it into a cream so we can actually stick it on the place where it really needed to happen? And it's been a bit of a holy grail in the dermatology world. That's what we've been trying to do for a long time. But the actual sheer chemical process of managing to get it to the right place in the right form and shape at the right dosage to do its job has been really difficult just because of the chemistry of the molecule. I've had the great fortune of working with some really talented skin formulation scientists over in the past when I worked in a dermatology company. And one of those got on the phone to me about a couple of years ago and said, I think I've solved this particular problem. Now you're in oncology, Simon, you might be interested. And of course, we all said, yes, hurrah, let's have a look. And so he's actually managed to devise a formulation that will chaperone this molecule through the skin to the right place where it's needed, in the right form and in the right concentration to do the job, which is to treat actinic keratosis and potentially stave off the conversion of those cells into cancers, which would be very, very exciting. And so last year it was all about, well, okay, this is a great idea. Does it actually work? We've got a couple of things to prove here. Firstly, we've got to prove that it actually does the job and take the molecule across to the right part of the skin in the right concentrations. And we did this in the School of Pharmacy, actually in London, where there is a group there that really specializes on skin permeation studies. And we managed at all concentrations of our particular cream to take this molecule to the right place in the right concentration or well above, so exceeding the concentration that was in line with that we saw in the oral phase 3 clinical trial. This is, in pharmaceutical terms, called a bioequivalence test, where you take the results of one administration, in this case oral, compare it with a new administration, and in our case, obviously topical, and if you get the same amount of compound pharmacokinetically reaching the target, hey, bingo, you've got bioequivalence. And in all of our tests, we exceeded that. So we were very excited by that, clearly. And the second question is, well, that's great, but is it safe? You're going to stick something on skin. If this actually holds up, it's going to be going slapped all over all the time. It could be a fantastic product. It could be turned into a sun cream, all sorts of opportunities. We have to know absolutely that it's safe. So unfortunately, we had to do this during COVID, and doing safety trials during COVID was obviously very difficult, but we managed to find a company that ran ex vivo skin irritation and sensitivity tests that have been accepted by the regulatory bodies. And they ran our formulation against their panel. And actually, it came out to be comparable to baby sun protection products that are already out there, which in a nutshell means this is about as safe as you're ever going to get. It's almost like putting water on your skin. It really is a safe compound. So we were surprised, very excited, clearly, and very grateful that we now have something that absolutely works. It's succeeded the bioequivalence test, which is a big marker. It's as safe as houses. Great. Let's move it on and commercialize it. So I think at this point, Tim, I'll let you take over again.
Yes, thank you, Sam. It's always interesting, I think, when you explain the background to our lead product, Sol, because I found myself getting more excited about it. Even just I've listened to it about 100 times. Obviously, I know it inside out. But so just a couple of slides to finish off. I've got a summary slide after this, but what is everybody looking to the company to do now? Where is the investment profile? Where is the investment excitement? It's very much around Sol and what we're doing with it. So our activity around Sol and the commercialization is split into two ways. One is to go down what we call the cosmetic route, and the other is the straightforward pharmaceutical route, which, if you remember, Martin was describing earlier how one goes through clinical development for a pharmaceutical. They're both two distinct markets, both very valuable to us if we get Sol through both. But we're concentrating at the moment on the cosmetic side, which is exactly what Simon describing about how one uses it on the skin and to prevent and treat this condition. And so at the moment, we are talking to two major cosmetic companies, global cosmetic companies. We're not in a position to let you know who that is, but I think everyone on this seminar tonight would recognize both names. So I hope that's encouraging for you. Those discussions are going very well, and it's our intention to try and enter into a commercialization deal with at least one of those over the next few months. We've given guidance that we're expected to do something by the end of this calendar year. So That goes back to the business model. If you all remember when I introduced the business model earlier on, that we're looking to commercialize our products as quickly as possible, start generating revenue, and starting to get that back into the company to make us self-sufficient. And Sol, we believe, will be the first product out of the bag, which will do that for us. But of course, we've got the pipeline coming on behind. So really exciting. And I have to say, the uniqueness of the technology of Sol is really sparking up interest in these big companies. It really is. Just the last summary slide, just to remind you. So yes, I've just described the commercialization discussions which we're having, which are going extremely well. I'll remind you about the business model, which is very specific, and we deliberately put the business model together as we have. And just remind you, it's to minimize investment in the portfolio, bring it through as quickly as possible, and start generating revenues to make ourselves self-sufficient. That is supported by a portfolio which is diverse, so we're spreading the risk clearly, and all those products are at different stages of development. But it's all in the oncology area, and obviously Sol bridges from oncology to dermatology as well. In terms of our corporate profile, we listed about 18 months ago on the Aqueous growth market. And as and when it's relevant, we are EIS VCT qualified. So that's the end of our presentation. Hopefully we haven't overrun too much. So I guess I'm going to hand back to Martin, is it, for Q&A?
The first one's quite a toughie, Tim. It's, I think it was from Hanif, who has asked the question, do you have a plan B ready in case the licensing deal for Sol takes longer to materialize than you had hoped?
I don't know why you say it's a tough one. It's a fairly good one, actually. So well done, Hanif. Yes, in our business, actually, to be fair, in most businesses, one has to be aware of risks and what ifs and if things don't pan out. And the whole world has just experienced that over the last 18 months or so with COVID, clearly. In terms of ourselves, I'm guessing that the question is directed towards maybe our sustainability, maybe our cash runway, when talking about Plan B. That and/or, if there's a delay in the commercialization, is there an alternative? I'm guessing here what's behind the question. But firstly, on the financial side, we're pretty well sorted on that. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that we did a fundraising earlier this year, so that gave us extra funds to see us through. And remind the audience once again that we're very parsimonious. We don't have large overheads. So obviously we're trying to get the commercialization of Sol done as quickly as possible. We've given guidance that we'll do something before the end of this year. But in the instance that it takes longer, which is behind the question, then existing shareholders and investors shouldn't be concerned that we're going to run out of money, because I think I'm guessing that's what's behind the question. But although we've got ongoing discussions with 2 global companies, there are actually coming in from the sidelines other companies that are still expressing interest. So it's not as if everything's on black and blue with 2 companies, if I can use that analogy. So I think we're pretty comfortable. We're feeling okay, if that's a complete answer to Hanif's question.
Thank you, Tim. The second one I recall was from Julie C. She is asking, whilst it's not in your control, is there an update? Can you provide an update on how Ellipsis Pharma is progressing? Is it EP0015?
Sorry, do you want me to take that again, or do you want to?
Either, it doesn't matter. Yeah, obviously, it's not in our control, as you said, but they're doing pretty well with it, without divulging anything that clearly I can't, because we're on a confidentiality with them too. I think we're very prepared to say that it will be hitting human trials very shortly, and their development has been good so far. So touch wood, we've got something coming into the market that should be really groundbreaking, actually. Apart from that, I think we have to wait and hear from them directly.
Could you advise the percentage stock holding the company directors hold, and the total
Yeah,
PLC,
sorry.
and the total PLC costs for the year.
Oh, crikey.
I can probably help.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I believe if my memory serves me right, that the directors have around 10%. I should know this, shouldn't I? But it's a good proportion. We have invested. Sorry.
10.5, Tim.
There you are. It's on your note, I think, isn't it? So I wasn't far off. And I think that demonstrates the belief we have in the company, because before we came to market, when we were a private company, we were investing our own money alongside private investors, and we all invested on the float itself, and we've invested more money since, either well, actually, and also buying shares in the marketplace as well as in new issues. So I think that 10% demonstrates our belief in the company. And there's nothing better to do that by putting your hand in your pocket and have the skin in the game. Yeah. And the second part of the question, just remind me, Martin. Sorry.
It was about your total PLC cost, but Tim, I've got that in front of me. So in answer to that question, on our note, basically the company has two costs. One is the general corporate overhead, and the other is the R&D spend, and they're split out on the front page. So it's about £600,000 is the answer to that question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Martin. It's useful you had those numbers to hand. But again, I just want to emphasize, if you look at any listed company, there are costs which you just cannot get away from being a listed company. Costs of the listing and advisors and everything which one has, and the fact that that our costs in that category, all PLC costs or overhead costs, corporate costs, coming as low as 600,000, I think does amplify or exemplify, I should say, the business model which I was describing earlier. That it's absolutely our determination to keep that overhead burden as low as possible for shareholders.
We've got a question from Kai, who has asked, do you have any thoughts on moving from the illiquid, difficult to trade Aqueous market to the AIM market, which would gain greater awareness?
I've lost count of the number of times we've been asked this question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I alluded to it earlier, and I'm a great supporter of Aqueous, actually, and I think it's developing almost on a monthly basis. And if you look at what they've done in terms of investment and how they're developing the market making, they're splitting the market into two different sectors. They've done a lot of innovative things, including using IT to the largest extent they can to facilitate trading. And like any developing market, if you go back 30 years or whatever it was when AIM first started, it was exactly the same, absolutely the same. And Martin, you and I have known each other a long time. You'll know this. I brought one of the first biotech companies to AIM within 12 months of it starting, and I had the same questions then. As I was CFO of that company. Well, why are you on this AIM market? It's illiquid, and half of the institutional investors in the city wouldn't look at AIM companies at that time. But that's all changed. I do believe it's going to be the same with Aqueous. So we're going to persist, and in fact, I don't believe it's as illiquid as people perceive it to be. I mean, we've had some pretty good volumes go through our book, in the 18 months or so since we've been on the market, and I haven't certainly heard any of our shareholders saying they've had difficulty in trading when they want to. So I think there's a perception issue here as well as a practical issue.
What comfort can you give private investors that if you need to raise further capital, you will give PIs or private investors the ability to participate?
Interesting. Sorry, I seem to be hogging these questions or answers, Simon. I'm sorry.
It's fine. No, you're doing great. I'm enjoying
it. I mean, I don't know if this is prompted by the rise of a primary bid, for example, which I have a lot of time for those guys. I think they've done a fantastic job in opening up new issues, especially on AIM, the main market, to private investors. Now, if we were at some point to raise more cash, then we would certainly look at that. I don't see any reason why we can't. and we know the guys there very well. So the short answer to the question is, because I'm sure you want to crack on with the next investing company, is that we will certainly do our best if we go out and raise new money in the future to give an opportunity for private investors to invest. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Matt, I thank you both very much. Very interesting presentation and well presented.
The next company to present is Shield, which is a commercial stage pharmaceutical company with a focus on the iron deficiency space. Lead product is called Ferrocru. This one's AIM listed with a market cap of just under £90 million. And today we're very lucky to have Greg, the CEO of the business, present to us. Greg, over to you.
Thank you again for the invitation to the conference. To Tim and Simon, very interesting presentation there. And I was thinking about as you're in discussions, we as Shield are at the very opposite end. I'm going to talk a lot today about the excitement around commercialization and drug launches and where we are. So I'm excited to be here. So let me see if I can. So I'm the CEO here. I joined Shield Therapeutics just 3 months ago. So June 1 was my start date here, and obviously jumped on board at a very exciting time, and happy to present our company to all of you today. As noted earlier, we are a company focused on the treatment of iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia, a very, very prevalent condition out there afflicting literally millions of patients worldwide. We are a London AIM-listed company, as you see listed here, and our primary focus is we are a commercial stage company. So Aqueous is our product, or ferric maltol as it's known in the US. Ferrocru is primarily what it's known as outside the US. And again, this is a novel oral iron treatment for treating iron deficiency in adults. I've been asked, coming into the presentation, they asked us to kind of condense our deck down to fit into about a 15-minute presentation. So for that reason, I'm going to concentrate almost all of my efforts today on the US. As you see noted here, back in the earlier spring, in March of earlier this year, the company went ahead and raised just under $40 million US in order to get the launch started in the US here. We officially commenced that launch with having product available in the wholesaler channel in the US in the third quarter. And as you see listed here, we've out-licensed the product to Norgine in Europe, where it is approved by the EMA and commercial available right now, primarily in the German and UK markets, among a few others. We did a deal back in the early part of 2020 with ASK Pharma for China. So we are in the development process there to get that towards approval. And then just last month, we announced a deal for the Republic of Korea with Korea Pharma starting, and so we're going to start that development work as we speak. So the product is out and available now in the US, as well as certain countries in Europe, and certainly progressing along the right development path outside of those two areas. Let me spend a little bit of time talking to you about the market and the opportunity. And, as Martin alluded to in his opening comments, what gets me out of the bed in the morning is things like this, right? When I look at, a product, what the opportunity is, understanding what the strategy is, how we might fit into what is out there in treatment, and just the excitement about an overall launch. And so in a nutshell, all this gets me out of bed in the morning and jumping away to get at my desk. So iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia, these are very, very prevalent conditions that cut across a lot of different disease states or underlying reasons that cause both the iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia. So you can see listed here, you got ranges of percentages for both iron deficiency, which is, really to distinguish the two. Iron deficiency is low iron stores, normally measured by ferritin levels in the body. And then iron deficiency anemia is where not only the iron store is low, but your hemoglobin gets to a threshold where you really start to feel the effects of this disease. And I should say, I don't have it in this deck per se, but iron deficiency anemia, it is a very, very serious and complicated disease. I've heard some people make the comment that if you're anemic slightly, you're a little tired or fatigued, and almost comparable to what the end of a long day or end of a long week might feel like. And that is not the case. That is dramatically underestimating, what this disease does to patients on an everyday basis. This is extreme fatigue, mental confusion, physical issues where just common everyday tasks, whether it be preparing the evening meal, climbing a flight of stairs, doing the laundry, they become almost insurmountable, right? So this is an area where not only is it highly prevalent, the good news for us is that it is treated by physicians. So in other words, this is not an area that we need to convince physicians to treat. If they see patients with iron deficiency anemia, whether it be low ferritins or low hemoglobins, they will act to treat. The challenges you'll see coming forward here is that the treatment options today are certainly lacking in a lot of different areas. There's a strong need for a new treatment such as Aqueous. But as I said, this cuts across a lot of different disease states overall. We have the luxury of our label being very broad, meaning that regardless of the etiology or underlying cause of the disease, we can treat it with our product of Aqueous. So our label is literally to treat iron deficiency in U.S. adults patients as well as in the EU as well. So on the treatment side, as I mentioned before, this is an area where if physicians see iron deficiency anemia, they will treat it. And really, right now, there's kind of two camps of treatment options that are available for physicians today. On the lower left-hand side, you'll see that very common is oral irons that are used. And these are primarily oral irons that are available over the counter in the US. These are ferrous-based irons, mostly ferrous salt-based irons overall, that literally you could walk down to any pharmacy and pick one up off the shelf and give it a try. So, they're convenient, they're readily available. The real challenge here is no matter if you talk to a patient, you talk to a clinician, or you talk to a loved one of a patient, the first words out of their mouth, generally speaking, are tolerability. You just can't tolerate it. A lot of GI adverse events, a lot of discontinuation rates as well, and just really not an efficient, absorption of the iron overall. So almost everybody will try these first universally, but a very, very high percentage of patients, do not continue with this therapy and don't get the treatment that they need. On the other end of the spectrum, depicted on the lower right-hand side here, is IV iron. Now, IV iron is very effective and as far as rapid iron repletion overall, good bioavailability. This is an area where you're literally infusing iron directly into the veins of the patient overall, so no surprise you're going to get a fast repletion of iron. The real challenge with IV irons is the infusion part. So you have to go to a hospital-based infusion center or a hematology clinic here in the US and sit through multiple infusions that take up multiple days in order to get the iron restored to the level you need it to be overall. So even pre-COVID, this is a real inconvenience factor where, if you're a working parent, you got to get time off of work, go to the infusion center, sit there for several hours and do this multiple times in order to get your iron stores back to where they need to be overall. You add, what we've all been dealing with the last, 20 months with COVID, quite frankly, the thought of patients going into an infusion center to get their iron, let's just say that's another, big barrier to kind of getting patients treated the way they should. So if you can think about these as, two ends of the spectrum, what you end up with is a lot of patients kind of sitting in the middle looking for a better oral iron treatment because they're not quite sick enough where they feel like they have to go to get an IV iron and take that time to go to the infusion center overall. So a very, very wide open space here for which to operate. Now in the US, the overall iron replacement market, which is made up of oral therapies and IV therapies, is extremely large, but you've got oral therapies making up almost 90% of that volume overall. So there are 10 million prescriptions per year for oral iron. So a very, very big market. And again, these are, OTCs, ferrous-based compounds, and generics of OTCs to try to get it covered for insurance overall. Down on the lower left-hand side, you see that, of this 10 million prescriptions per year, there's about 65,000 physicians that drive almost 2/3 of that oral iron volume. So that's your segment that you want to really think about here is those 65,000 physicians. And importantly, as shown on the graph on the right-hand side, this is primarily made up of primary care physicians and OBGYNs. Those are by far and away number one and number two. Following that, you've got a smattering of gastroenterologists and hematologists and a few other specialties, but primary care physicians and OBGYNs drive the overwhelming majority of that volume. There's a couple slides in here showing some market research that we did. And this was fielded in June of this year, so just before we made the product available and had our sales force go out and start calling on physicians. This was done with 102 physicians, all of which are very high prescribing oral iron physicians. So we kind of looked at those 65,000 physicians. You'll see that we are calling on about 4,000 of those. This 100-person market research was fielded mostly from that 4,000 physician target list, and it's made up of primarily primary care physicians, OBGYNs, and specialists. So the questions we asked them on the left-hand side to start with is, what is your current satisfaction level with currently available oral iron replacement therapies? And you can see here, regardless of the specialty, whether it be primary care, OBGYN, or specialist, which in this case is GI and hematology, it's a very low satisfaction level with currently available oral irons. So as I said before, I think everybody knows that they're available, they try them, but even physicians have a low satisfaction and really a low believability that they're actually going to work. But again, everybody tries those first. When you shift gears and ask them on the right-hand side, what is it that you would like to have from an attribute perspective in an iron replacement therapy? The obvious questions come up, or answers come up. Well-tolerated, effective, and I would add and certainly adhere to be affordable from an out-of-patient pocket cost to the patient overall. So they're not happy with what they have right now from oral replacement therapy. What they want is a better tolerated and effective therapy that they can give to their patients. So we believe we have that in Aqueous. So Aqueous is ferric maltol. Aqueous is the brand name in the US. And this kind of relatively complicated graph describes what makes us different and unique versus what's available right now on the over-the-counter basis. And the way that I think about this and the way I like to describe this is simple, that ferrous-based compounds, which are primarily the over-the-counters, what happens when a patient takes those and swallows them, as soon as it gets into their stomach, the product dissociates. So the product has to dissociate, the iron has to dissociate from the salt in order to be absorbed. But as soon as that happens, you have free iron floating in the gut, which A, can irritate the gut, but B, creates reactive oxygen species and starts basically this whole cascade of events in your stomach, which leads to a lot of the adverse events you see. So again, when you look at OTCs, ask clinicians what the issues are, it's GI-related adverse events, tolerability, and a lot of discontinuation rates. So what makes ferric maltol different? So ferric maltol is ferric iron surrounded by a maltol coating. So we kind of shield it in that regard. What that allows it to do, it allows the ferric maltol, when taken by a patient, when they swallow it, it not only goes through the gut, but gets into the large intestine before it starts to dissociate. So basically the way to think about this is the iron gets delivered right to the point in the large intestine where it's going to be absorbed before it starts to break apart. So number one, you bypass that whole negative cascade that I described that takes place in the gut because that's not happening there. And number two, we're a relatively low dose iron. We only have 60 milligrams that's taken per day, so 30 milligrams twice a day. We're relatively low dose iron because again, the iron's getting to where it's going to be absorbed and has maximal absorption. So we believe, based on the clinical trials, which I'll showcase here in a minute, not only are you going to get the effectiveness you need to treat the iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia, but you do it in a way that is better tolerated and well tolerated by the patients. So we did a couple different trials. This is showcasing our study that we did for patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And if folks know people with either ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, this is typically a pretty difficult patient population to treat. These are quiescent patients overall. And it's a busy slide, but way to think about this is two different studies, right? So you first had the 12-week pivotal phase shown on the left-hand side of that graph. And then you had the long-term extension phase where we extended that 12 weeks out another 52 weeks overall. This was 128 patients, double-blind, placebo-controlled. Again, that primary 12-week phase was showcasing the effectiveness of Aqueous from an efficacy standpoint of can we raise hemoglobin levels up. And you see in the left-hand graph there that we are very, very effective at raising hemoglobin levels from a baseline of just over 11 to about 13 and a half overall during that 12-week pivotal period, highly statistically significant against placebo. We then took those same patients and kept them on Aqueous all the way for another 52 weeks. And you see that we're able to maintain that hemoglobin levels very, very effectively over during that time. Conversely, we took the placebo patients from that 12-week study, put them on Aqueous after that 12th week and watch them go through another 52 weeks. And again, you see a nice rise in hemoglobin levels overall during that 52-week extension period. So this showcases a couple things. Number one, you can get kind of rapid restoration of your iron stores and your hemoglobin levels shown here across the first 12 weeks. but then importantly, you can actually maintain those same hemoglobin and iron levels for a long period of time. So for patients that are chronically ill, as many of these patients are, this showcases very well the overall effectiveness, both in a short-term, but also a long-term maintenance type of therapy. I mentioned tolerability before, and this is our tolerability profile across our phase 3 studies. I should add that we also did a study in chronic kidney disease patients that was very similar in design to the IBD study I just showed you. Again, for brevity's presentation, I didn't put that graph in there, but very similar results as far as increasing hemoglobin levels, as well as showcasing a maintenance on the back end. So this tolerability profile is kind of the pooled data of both the IBD study as well as the CKD populations. You see on the right-hand side, the graph, showcasing adverse events. And honestly, when you have a product, when you're doing a placebo-controlled study, when your product can be below 5%, from an adverse event perspective, it almost becomes comparable to placebo. So we're really, really happy with a lot of these results. Very important for us is on the lower left-hand side that the overall percentage of patients who discontinued treatment due to AEs was extremely low at 4.6%. So as I described before, how Aqueous works, why it's different than ferrous-based compounds overall, we think our clinical data showcases a very strong effort here that we have something that physicians are looking for, an oral iron therapy that is effective but also well tolerated by the patients. So I mentioned where we kind of position this is in between these oral OTCs as well as IV iron. So going to the US launch, we made product available in the US July 1st. And that is the point that our sales reps, they were hired during the second quarter. They started to begin to set up appointments with physicians in the US as of July 1st. So I think as we look at this market research going into the launch, a couple things to point out here. On the top is the question that we asked around awareness. So how many physicians were aware of Aqueous prior to us launching overall? And you can see from an unaided perspective, I'd say that answer was 0. In fact, I think there was one physician out of 102 that had heard of Aqueous going in. Now, this is certainly a challenge that we are taking active steps to kind of work on, which I'll describe here for all of you. However, I'm not surprised by this. This was not a shock. So the company pivoted rather quickly. There wasn't a lot of market development work, not a lot of pent-up demand about Aqueous. So really, we need to get out there and drive awareness. The way that we're doing it for the first couple months is primarily through our 30-person sales force, getting in front of physicians. We've got our website up and running, but as you'll see soon that we've got a broader media plan and awareness driving plan that's just kicking off here during this quarter. On the good news front, on the lower left-hand side, when physicians were shown a profile of Aqueous, they had a very, very positive reaction. Very positive reaction, strong interest in learning more. And in the lower right-hand side, you see that where they positioned Aqueous vis-a-vis what they currently use today, it is very consistent with the way that we think about where they use it, which is right after OTC failures, and certainly before they go to an IV iron perspective. So for us, as we get out there and launch, I think as I look at this, for the first 6 to 9 months, this is really what we need to do, right? Number one, how do we redefine the expectations of an oral iron therapy? We all saw that when they think of oral irons, they don't have a high confidence in them. We need to change that mindset. We're going to do that with Aqueous. Number 2 is driving awareness. Number 3 is building up our advocates. Number 4 is making it easy for patients to start and stay on therapy. And you see down the lower text here, drive awareness is critical. Generating clinical experience for patients and physicians, and then certainly establishing our payer coverage. On the payer coverage side, we are very focused right now in the US on commercial payers and pharmacy benefit managers, which drive most of that commercial landscape. We are contracting with them to get added to formulary, and our positioning is consistent with what we've talked about before, which is after failure of an OTC, so kind of a second line positioning from a formulary perspective. Now, important that it takes time to get on formulary. There's generally about 6 steps that have to take place where, setting an appointment to do a clinical presentation, setting an appointment to do a business discussion, having negotiations about the business discussion, getting a contract put in place, and then negotiating the contract. And then finally is the start date of that. So, all of that takes time. It can take up to 12 months in order to get yourself on formulary, and every payer kind of works at different timelines, but generally speaking, it can be, a relatively long process. So important for us, while we're building up our payer coverage, is making sure that the physicians that we get in front of that want to write Aqueous for their patients, they can do so and the patient can get that. And the way that we do that is with our reimbursement hub, where physician writes a prescription, goes into our reimbursement hub. We determine quickly if the patient has insurance. If it does, that prescription is filled under the insurance. If they don't, we'll turn around and sell that directly to the patient for nominal cost. And then we'll repeat that process every month to check, is the patient's insurance covering it now? So as our payer coverage builds over time, these patients will move from nominally cost patients that we're selling to directly into paying patients under the insurance side. But importantly, it gets the patient on the drug and gets the physician some access and experience here as well. So our overall launch strategy, you can see here depicted by the triangle, this is that 65,000 physicians I mentioned before that are driving almost 2/3 of the oral iron prescriptions. We are calling on the top 4,000 today with a field force of 30 representatives. That's about the coverage we can hit, is those 4,000 physicians. Anecdotally, the feedback, when we can get in front of a physician, when it's not a COVID-related issue, when we can get in front of a physician, they are very receptive to the message, a lot of interest, so very consistent with what we've seen on the market research side. I noted that our payer meetings and discussions were ongoing. On the left-hand side, you'll see from an awareness perspective, a lot of our digital and media placements targeted to drive that awareness launched earlier this month and are still launching. So throughout this quarter, we continue to get out there to figure out how do we drive awareness amongst this broader physician set overall. And then lastly, we think about, how do we get broader access to these, other physicians there? There's a lot of different tactical ways that we can do that will run in concert with our payer coverage coming online as well.
Greg, thanks very much. There's a lot of questions. So I think given the time, I'm going to try and clump them together. The first one, we've got one from Joe about slow European sales growth. But I think actually it links very much to other questions from James and Mo, which essentially is what can be done to improve the performance of Norgine in Europe, whilst accepting there is some disruption from COVID, the performance of Norgine appears tepid. Do you have very much influence over how this can be boosted?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I apologize, I didn't put too much on the European side just for conciseness of the presentation. But look, I've had several discussions with the Norgine team since my arrival here. And, obviously without disclosing, a lot of details on those discussions, what I found from a team is a couple of things. One is they're very motivated and very excited about Veracruz. It's known there in Europe overall. I was able to spend some time specifically with the German team. And, I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing underneath, right? I think they have the right strategy, the right mindset overall. COVID definitely kind of had an impact, on things, but it's notable that we saw our half-year results. They had a 51% increase in the overall packs sold in the first half of 2021 versus the back half of 2020. That's a very encouraging sign. As I kind of peeled away underneath that, I'm encouraged by some of the things that they're doing from a tactical perspective. Physicians are calling on, underlying results. So, by no means is that a promise, but I do believe they're very much on the right track. In addition to that, what we worked on is, we really need to get the reimbursement accelerated, if at all possible, in the other countries, right? So Germany is great. There's some things we need to work on from the UK in order to drive, better uptake there. But then certainly thinking about, Spain, Italy, France, how do we accelerate that reimbursement process? So more to follow there, but my initial interactions with them have been encouraging, but obviously I'm watching it very closely.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of questions on the US, as you can imagine, but I'll try and sort of clump a few of them together. In terms of what one relates to, is the size of your sales force sufficient to penetrate and educate the US market? So those 4,000 key prescribers you were targeting, and related to that, how many of the target physicians have been reached out to date, since the launch in June, and maybe in answering those, you might want to follow that with what's the biggest disappointment so far following the US launch?
So the first question is the 4,000, is our sales force sufficient to cover that? And my short answer is it's sufficient to cover the 4,000, But certainly, as you saw, there's a lot of physicians that are out there that write prescriptions that we're not reaching today. So now there's different ways to reach them, right? And this is part of what the work the team and I have been doing here, right? So from a broad-based perspective, to drive awareness, right? We launched our media plan, kind of other digital tactics overall to drive broader awareness of Aquifer, and that can reach a lot more physicians, obviously, than a direct personal rep overall, right? So number one is like, how do we start to drive that awareness? Number two is our 30 reps working really hard to get in front of those 4,000 physicians they're targeting, and make them aware of Aquifer, generate prescriptions, get the clinical experience. I think we've done, I'd say, a decent job of getting in front of physicians overall, like everywhere else. Not to use this as an excuse, but COVID has certainly kind of, been back and forth with the Delta variant. You get different pockets in the U.S. that are accessible, not accessible. So, it's not like a normal launch where you just have unfettered access, across the board. So, I think we've been doing a decent job. I'm not going to give any metrics today, but the team is working really hard to get in front of those physicians overall. The question becomes then, how do we start to reach some of those other physicians, right? So, assuming we get the payer coverage that I expect we'll get over time, how do we generate prescriptions and the targets we're calling on now, but how do we reach those others? And there's a multitude of ways you can do that through either, direct personal promotion by expanding your team, indirect personal promotion. There's lots of different options that we are exploring right now in order to really maximize the effectiveness of that overall. Is there a disappointment in the launch? No, I would definitely not classify anything I've seen thus far as a disappointment. I would just point out that the biggest challenge, that we had to overcome, and I've talked about this a little bit, in addition to getting your payers to cover your product, which is critical, it's that low awareness, right? It would have been optimal to have, maybe a 12 months of kind of awareness driving, get some KOLs on board. We didn't have that luxury, right? So drive the awareness now. For the first couple months, it's been, to use the terminology, it's been hand-to-hand combat, right? It's literally relying on our 30 reps to get in front of a doctor to make them aware of the product and then make them aware of it over and over again. So, that's not the most efficient way to do it, but we're getting to where we need to be.
Is there a risk that the company has become an attractive takeover target given its low valuation? So I suppose what he's really asking is what sort of defense strategy you've got if something like that were to happen.
I'll be honest, my focus right now is really just, building the right business here for the long term, right? And, I don't look at the stock price on a day-to-day basis. I've got, 1,000 other things that we're trying to do here, but we want to make sure we're building a good, solid business. So, executing really well in the US, as the earlier question, accelerating, adoption here in Europe as well. We take care of what we can do and we can control. I can't really spend a lot of time worrying if someone's going to come in and, want to buy us and what that might look like or react to it when it gets there, obviously. But, for me, it's all right, how do we build a very strong but very successful business, and we'll let everything else kind of play itself out.
And I think just a quick one from John. He just inquires, what price are you selling it at in the United States, and how does it compare with Europe?
So that's a really complicated question, and probably not a good one to try to draw comparables to, because the market's so different. Every country in Europe is different than the US, so it's probably not worthwhile to spend a lot of time at. Our wholesale acquisition price in the US is $500 per month overall, and then whatever discounts, rebates we need to give to payers to get on formularies, all that eventually would be rolled up in our gross to net. But trying to compare prices across the myriad of different areas, it's a bit of a challenge to do.
Greg, thank you very much. I think just to keep on time, we'll move on, but there are a lot more questions for you to answer after the event, but we'll come back and liaise with you on and get them listed.
Now, the final company presenting tonight is Diurnal. This is a European but UK headquartered business that specialises in hormone therapeutics to aid lifelong treatment for rare and chronic endocrine, I pronounced that correctly, conditions. This is another AIM listed business. It's got a market cap of about £90 million. And the speaker joining us today is the CEO, Martin Whitaker. Martin, over to you.
So, as Keith mentioned, my name's Martin Whitaker. I'm the CEO of Diurnal, and it's really my pleasure to round off the presentations this evening with Diurnal, a revenue-generating European biotech, but with global ambitions. So just to give you a quick company snapshot, Diurnal was listed on AIM in December 2015. Our current market cap is hovering around 100 million pounds sterling. We have a strong cash position as of the end of June 2021 with 34 million pounds in the bank, and importantly, we have no debt. We are backed by a diverse and wide group of long-term investors, headed up by IP Group, and also healthcare specialists such as Polar Capital. And importantly, we have an experienced board and executive management team that really transcends all the key aspects that we need to make Diurnal a success. Expertise ranging from product development through to commercialization, and through to taking companies through to exit. So last week, we announced our full year results to the end of June 2021, and we made significant operational progress during our last 12 months. In terms of what we do, we're addressing two endocrine hormonal diseases with high unmet need, with our three lead products, with a valuable early stage pipeline that we're bringing through into the clinic. Alkindi and Defmody are focused on diseases of cortisol deficiency. This is a market opportunity of greater than $3 billion per annum. And Alkindi primarily focuses on treating children with these diseases of cortisol deficiency. Alkindi is launched in Europe and it's generating revenues from our own commercial infrastructure. And in the last financial year, we generated 2.3 million pounds worth of revenue. Moving across the pond, Alkindi was approved during a period and launched with our partner Eton Pharmaceuticals in the US. So very happy to say that it joins that list that Martin Hall presented earlier on for approvals for 2020. And also during the period, we had several patent grants, particularly in Europe. So we have strong exclusivity around Alkindi all the way out to 2034. But really, over the past 6 months, what has really changed for the company, what will be our driver of growth in the future, is our second product, Defmody, which is primarily targeted at adults and adolescents with these diseases of cortisol deficiency. And Defmody was approved by the European Medicines Agency and also by the MHRA here in the UK, and is launched now and generating revenues in Europe. And that was launched this month. And we have sufficient cash with the fundraisings that we've undertaken over the past 12 months to really drive the Alkindi and Defmody franchise, as we call it, in Europe through to profitability. In the US, we have agreed the route through to registration with the US regulator, the FDA, and also with a Japanese regulator as well. And that trial will start shortly. And again, Defmody is underpinned by strong exclusivity with granted patents, which take the protection out to 2034. In terms of our next product, Ditest, this is an oral native testosterone formulation targeting a huge market of approximately $5 billion of low testosterone or male hypergonadism. And here again, we've made significant progress over the past 12 months with a route all the way through to registration agreed with the FDA. With this product portfolio, we have all the attributes to become a world-leading endocrinology specialty pharma company, establishing commercial traction by our lead products, continuing to develop products through into the clinic and bring them to market, and there's always potential to add other products into our portfolio to accelerate our international profile. So the opportunity that for Diurnal that we see is really addressing significant unmet medical needs in endocrinology. And these needs are often around chronic diseases that require lifelong treatment. So one such group of diseases is where we're targeting are diseases of cortisol deficiency. And cortisol is an essential hormone for life. Without it, you'll die. And for those patients that cannot produce cortisol, they'll need to be replaced by an oral cortisol replacement therapy every day for the rest of their lives. There are two main causes of cortisol deficiency. The first is a group of diseases called adrenal insufficiency, where patients lose the ability to produce cortisol during their lifetime, either caused by an autoimmune disease or sometimes by a benign tumor in your pituitary gland just behind your brain, which switches off cortisol production. The typical symptoms associated with adrenal insufficiency are chronic fatigue. 50% of these patients can't work, and they're always at risk of what's called an adrenal crisis, where they don't have enough cortisol in the body to, for example, fight off an infection. And if they do have an adrenal crisis, then often this leads to the patient going unconscious, perhaps a visit to intensive care. And unfortunately, each year, some of these patients do unfortunately die. The second group of diseases of cortisol deficiency that we're targeting are a group called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH for short. And these are a group of genetic diseases which present from birth. And CAH patients have two issues. Firstly, they cannot produce cortisol, and they have the chronic fatigue that adrenal insufficiency patients have. And secondly, because they have an enzyme block in the body, the building blocks of cortisol cannot be made into the hormone, and they build up in the bloodstream, causing damage. And these are potent sex hormones or androgens that are buzzing around the patient's bloodstream. So, for example, if you're a little girl that's born with CAH, you may be born with ambiguous genitalia. So little girls may look like little boys at birth, and that may require corrective surgery during their lifetime. Both little girls and little boys go through puberty very early on in life, perhaps the ages of 5 or 6. So you grow very quickly as young children. But when it comes to the teenage years where puberty should occur, actually growth is turned off. These patients end up being much shorter than average in adulthood, and complications continue in adulthood in terms of fertility, cardiovascular issues, and ultimately these patients will die some 7 years earlier than the normal population. So both of these diseases are associated with high morbidity and higher mortality. And it's really Diurnal's goal, and a goal that now we can achieve, certainly in Europe, to treat these patients effectively, initiating on Alkindi from birth, transitioning onto F-MODI during adolescence, and then continuing on F-MODI for the rest of the patient's lives. So how are we doing? So firstly, I'll start with Alkindi, which is based on the active ingredient hydrocortisone, which is the synthetic version of cortisol. So chemically the same, so we're replacing like for like in the body. And Alkindi is a first product specifically designed for children suffering from pediatric adrenal insufficiency and congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And in that respect, we have first mover advantage both in Europe and on the other side of the pond as well. So in Europe, Alkindi was approved in 2018 by the European Medicines Agency. It came with 10 years data and market exclusivity under what is called a pediatric use market authorization, or PUMA, and that takes that exclusivity out to 2028, supplemented by our recently granted patents all the way out to 2034. The opportunity that we see for Alkindi, but also for F-MODI, is a way that these medicines are prescribed. So if you have a disease of cortisol deficiency, you'll be referred to a specialist treatment center, so usually a large university-type hospital. And actually, there are relatively few of these centers across Europe. And the opportunity that we have is actually to market the product ourselves in the larger European territories. And that's what we've done with Alkindi, launching using our own commercial infrastructure in the UK, Germany, Austria, and Italy. Where populations are lower, or the geography is more challenging, such as the Nordics, we have distribution agreements in place outside of our core European territories. Pricing and reimbursement discussions are ongoing in other territories in Europe where we don't have reimbursement at the moment. And we've entered into global and licensing and distribution agreements in place for the US and other key territories, which I'll touch upon in a minute. So FMODI is a modified release hydrocortisone. So again, it's based on the synthetic version of the native hormone. And this is approved in Europe and the UK for adolescents and adults with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And the key thing about FMODI is that it is the first physiological treatment for this patient group with CAH. And FMODI treats this patient group effectively by addressing the two key issues that patients face. Firstly, it's able to replace cortisol in a physiological way to replace the natural rhythm of cortisol that is absent in these patients. And if you look at the graph here, in normal healthy individuals, we have a very striking rhythm of cortisol about the day. It's one of the most striking rhythms, daily rhythms we have in nature, shown in orange here. If you have CAH, you don't have this rhythm, but by taking FMODI twice a day in what we call a toothbrush regimen, lasting at night, first thing in the morning, we're able to approximate this rhythm about the 24-hour period. And importantly, we're able to provide overnight coverage of cortisol, and that's important because this is where the buildup of these harmful androgens occurs in patients, causing damage to the body. So we're able to control androgens as well, effectively with FMODI, and this is data taken from our pivotal phase 3 European trial, the largest ever interventional study carried out in this rare disease. And although the trial did not meet its primary endpoint, we were able to show that FMODI gave better control of androgens over the 24-hour period compared to the standard of care, but particularly gave better control first thing in the mornings when the androgens traditionally are highest. And when patients transitioned onto the long-term extension study, we saw this good androgen control continued for up to 18 months, which is our last data point in the study. And 80% of patients continued to have their androgens controlled into the optimal range. And importantly, they had their androgens controlled on a lower dose of steroid, which is very important for the patient and from a regulatory perspective, because this avoids some of the chronic steroid side effects that occur in this patient group. And we were able to reduce the steroid by a third, from 30 milligrams per day in a pivotal study to 20 milligrams per day at 18 months of a safety extension study. In terms of our commercial progress, as I mentioned, we launched in Germany and Austria earlier on this month. That's following on from a market authorization from the European Commission over the summer. We're using our existing knowledge and expertise gained through Alkindi to progress our marketing, access, and pricing and reimbursement activities. And we believe that we'll realize significant synergies in the utilization of our existing European commercial infrastructure. So our reps now can carry 2 products as opposed to 1, and they're still calling on these same specialist treatment centers. Following the European launch, we launched in the UK at the beginning of last week, and that's following approval from the MHRA again over the summer. And that launch in the UK is nearly 2 quarters ahead of schedule from what we predicted over the summer. And I think that's testament to the really hard effort that the Diurnal team has put in over the past 3 or 4 months since approval. And in terms of the rest of the world, availability will be driven through our existing partners using the European clinical trial data package. And we have global and distribution agreements in place for all key territories, which are shown here. So in terms of business development, it's been extremely busy 12 to 18 months for Diurnal. We've entered into a number of licensing, marketing and distribution agreements across the globe, primarily with Eton Pharmaceuticals, initially in the US, but subsequently extended to Canada for Alkindi Sprinkle, as the Alkindi product is known across the pond. And that deal includes a number of royalties on sales and milestones as well, Some of those we have already received up front and have been announced previously. We've also expanded our global reach to countries such as China, again through a similar licensing agreement to the Eton deal. And thereafter, we have a whole group marketing and distribution agreements ranging from Turkey, across Europe, to Israel, to Switzerland, and also further afield to Australia and New Zealand. And in fact, during a period, we announced that Alkindi is now approved in Australia for all ages, not just pediatrics, and also in Israel as well. And we anticipate launching those territories shortly. One of the major things that the FMODI approval in Europe has enabled us to do is that actually we can use this modified release hydrocortisone, which was development name Chronocort, in other related indications of cortisol deficiency. So at the moment, we have a license in Europe for genetic disease, CAH, but we intend to start a trial shortly in the acquired disease AI. It's still a rare or orphan disease, but there are 5 or 6 times as many patients as there are genetic patients, and we aim to expand to this indication via a line extension study and then apply to the regulators. Across the pond, we've agreed the clinical study design in the US for genetic disease, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and that study design has also been agreed by the Japanese regulator. And if the audience are interested in the study designs, the endpoints, and more details on those studies, then those studies can be found in the appendix to this presentation. And we intend to start both of these studies in the next quarter, and that will open up valuable opportunities for a modified release hydrocortisone product in other indications and territories. Finally, I'll just touch upon Digest, which is our third product to treat to treat male hypergonadism. It's an oral native testosterone product. The issue in hypergonadism is that most products are either topical or taken by injection, which are painful or inconvenient for the patient, and also have well-documented safety issues. What most patients would like is an oral testosterone therapy, and that is what we've developed. We completed a phase 1 clinical study in the UK a couple of years ago, which showed that we can achieve very good levels of testosterone in the bloodstream to replace the testosterone that is missing. We shared that data with the FDA in a pre-IND meeting, and the FDA have confirmed the route through to registration can progress via a specialized or abbreviated route called the 505(b)(2) route in the US. And what this means is that we can use not only diurnal generated clinical data to support our registration, but we can also use bibliographical and literature data to support that registration as well. And that significantly de-risks the program, both financially and also clinically, in that we don't need to carry out as many clinical trials. So in terms of what we need to carry out to achieve that registration, the FDA indicated that we need just 2 further clinical studies, a phase 1 multiple ascending dose study, which is funded, and we intend to start early in 2022. We then need to go back and speak to the FDA for an end of phase 2 meeting, and that just leaves us with 1 pivotal phase 3 trial to carry out in the US. The FDA have indicated that trial could be in as few as 150 hypergonadal men, and really they're looking for pharmacokinetic endpoints, or really levels of testosterone in the bloodstream between 300 and 1,000 nanograms per deciliter as the primary endpoint, an endpoint which we believe is absolutely attainable. So in terms of the outlook coming up, it's been a busy year for us already during 2021 with the approval of FMODI, both in Europe and in the UK. We've concluded our discussions with the US regulator for the Chronocort FMODI study for CAH across the pond. And importantly, we've now commercially launched our second product in Europe and in the UK. So what's coming up? We're starting these additional clinical studies Firstly, in the US in Q4 this year for Chronocort in the CAH patient group, and then also in Europe, this line extension to the Adrenal Insufficiency patient group. And thereafter, we also will start the dye test study shortly after submitting our regulatory documentation to the FDA. So with that, I will just summarize that we're building a global endocrinology specialty pharma company. We've established a strong position in orphan diseases around diseases of cortisol deficiency. We have a credible market access strategy, which has been exemplified by Alkindi in Europe already. We have opportunities to broaden the offering, not only with valuable line extensions, but also our pipeline as well. And we have a strong team with the ability to deliver. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass over to Martin for the Q&A.
The share price of Eton suggests that the market is not overly excited by its performance. How do you feel that Eton is doing with Alkindi? Has Eton made repeat orders for supplies?
So to answer that question, Martin, I mean, we're very happy with Eton Pharmaceuticals as a partner. They've invested heavily in the product in the US. And if Alkindi Sprinkle is successful, it will be Eton's biggest selling product. So they're giving it, the utmost attention. In terms of the weakness in the Eton share price over the past few months, Eton has a number of other products going through registration at the moment. And I think the share price is not related directly to Alkindi, but to a number of announcements that Eton put out that some of those products, one product was approved, one was delayed by the FDA, and one product they needed to provide some additional data to the FDA. So I think it's probably best described as a sort of mixed bag of news for Eton, and that's had the effect on their share price.
And has Eton reordered from you?
Yes, so we have. So in terms of the reorders, we have had those from Eton.
Was there very much interest in the commercial rights to Chronocort in the US? How do you think this might change when the drug is de-risked through the clinical trial you're about to embark upon?
So at the time when we were progressing the Alkindi license agreement, we spoke to a number of companies that are also very interested in Chronocort. You've always got the opportunity to perhaps license at an earlier stage, but actually we felt as a company that we had raised sufficient funding. We have raised sufficient funding now to carry out that clinical trial in the US, which will take through to its conclusion. And therefore, we believe that we can de-risk that program significantly. And the chances are that it will be a better deal, all things being equal, if we have positive data in the US from a phase 3 study than before we had a pre-phase 3 study deal in the US.
A quick one. What's the size of your addressable market? You might want to just repeat what you said from the presentation. And he also asked, when do you expect to see a step change in revenues?
So in terms of the addressable market, I'll just talk about our approved products. So Alkindi or Alkindi Sprinkle, the addressable market there is around $200 million per annum. That breaks down to approximately $100 million in the US, around $66 million in Europe, and the rest is made up of the rest of the world. And then for FMODI, for genetic disease, congenital adrenal hyperplasia in Europe, that market is around $250 million per annum, and that increases to almost $2 billion for the acquired disease, adrenal insufficiency. And I can direct Michael to slides in the appendix when the slide deck goes live for some more detailed figures there, broken down by territory and by disease as well. In terms of a step change in sales, I mean, one of the key challenges that we've had over the past 12 to 18 months of a pandemic is of course, COVID. And, if anybody listening has tried to go and see a doctor, a physician of late, it's nigh on impossible. Certainly in the UK, and that's really affected us in terms of, yes, our reps can't get into hospitals, but importantly, our patients can't get into hospitals either, particularly to switch onto Alkindi, which often requires a longer type appointment with a physician and also a specialist nurse to switch over medicine, make sure that the child, the parent, or the caregiver is educated appropriately in the new medicine before they go back and start prescribing. So that's really affected us. We had a launch in Italy, which was affected very similar to I think how Shield was affected. That we launched in Italy, and a week later they locked down. What we've seen actually since lockdown measures have abated in several countries is actually face-to-face meetings have returned, and with that there's been an uptick in prescriptions as well as those face-to-face meetings have occurred. So we would anticipate if COVID has abated, that we should return to a trajectory of growth that we had before COVID.
Do you see many opportunities for M&A activity to add to your portfolio and make better use of your infrastructure?
Yes, the endocrinology market beyond diabetes, which was actually huge and dominated by the large players, is actually a relatively small niche area with relatively few players, and we keep in regular contact with all the key companies in the area. We do assess several products each year as to the suitability to perhaps bring on board to Diurnal. I think if I was to sort of classify them, the type of product that we see is typically a US company that's developed a product for the US market at a premium price. They don't really want to get involved in Europe, and they would look to companies such as Diurnal with our European infrastructure to market that product. But often, unfortunately, the price of the US pricing doesn't work in Europe. And although we've seen a number of really good US products, we just know that we won't be able to commercialize them effectively in Europe based on the pricing. That's not to say there aren't any out there, and we continue to actively look in the marketplace to bring products in and hopefully in due course to put them into our reps' bags.
What appears to be the holdup with medicine in Israel?
A lot of these territories, not only medicine in Israel, but also in Europe, once you have the approval, the pricing and reimbursement then goes to a different government agency, and that can take, differing amounts of time to come through. So the good news is we've got the approval in Israel, and that was achieved just over 12 months ago. We've been going through a pricing and reimbursement process, and we hope that will conclude shortly. But dealing with the government agencies, does take a long time in terms of pricing and reimbursement. We just have to be patient, and we hope to launch Alkindi with our partner Medison in Israel shortly.
So it's been a great session. Thank you very much indeed for everybody who's attended, and to the companies.